lecture is going to take us on the flip side of the globe to Mumbai, India, and take us through really one of, I think, our most extraordinary efforts to deconstruct disciplinary practice and to reframe it as a form of agency, modesty, deep interpersonal knowledge, connection, and bring it back out as, I think of it as a kind of light and modest architecture, but one that is catalytic and transformative. And I'm interested in having this group assemble, respond and engage you on the richness of your consideration. So, Valerie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bert. So my title, Creating Common Ground, Architecture for Tactical Learning and Creative Convergence. I want to first say a special thank you to a whole lot of people on this list, but especially to my committee, Jana van der Groot, Garth Rackhessel, and Luis Quiros and Powell Draper, as well as to people who advised me in the thesis process, including Leticia Britos Cabaneros, Michael Ambrose, David Conrath, and then folks from the Academy for Innovation and Entrepreneurship here at University of Maryland. And then, of course, to my family for their support, my studio cohort for being amazing collaborators and for partially inspiring this thesis, and for everyone else in the school, the faculty and students for being incredible mentors and partners. Tactical learning. A field of pragmatic opportunity that disrupts the everyday by disclosing possibility. Colin McFarland said this. I use his book, Learning the City, as a key reference in most of my work. Today I'll talk about the hypothesis and scope of my thesis, the methodology through which I came by this design, as well as the site program, and then the parameters for success. First, I want to kind of start off, perhaps this will make you a little uncomfortable, but I want you to think about what your greatest accomplishment is to date. And I'm going to ask you. So any brave volunteers want to offer up their greatest accomplishment to date?
Having 2 children.
Having 2 children.
I was going to say the same thing.
Awesome, okay. And how did that make you feel?
Strong and weak at the same time, but mostly strong and full of joy.
Cool, okay. Anyone else?
Finishing the semester.
Yes, amen. We do. Finishing the semester, and how did that make you feel?
Relieved.
Relieved, great. So these feelings are similar feelings that I have had kind of the last few years participating in a series of groups. Both this kind of mixture of feeling a sense of strength, feeling relief at getting through challenges, but also kind of, exhilaration and empowerment. I've been a part of the University of Innovation Fellows, which is a group of people from across the nation, they're students, that come together and basically challenge each other to do real-world projects around defining social needs and sparking innovation on their campuses. Through this group, and also the Academy for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, we've designed numerous learning experiences that both map out space and how people learn within those spaces, but then also it's kind of this continual coming together with other people to kind of wreak havoc on the system and rethink a lot of today's problems. So this is how I got here. Through these groups, I was able to experience a sense of empowerment, like, oh, I can do this. Other people in the world are doing this. I can also be a part of and kind of have agency in this world. So through this process, I realized, yes, a great deal of this learning experience happened because of the catalyst, which were people. But as an architecture student, I wanted to know and understand what in our environment, or can our environments stimulate creativity. And if so, what? And so that was kind of the main driver of my thesis. I then kind of shifted, realizing the privilege I was in being exposed to these opportunities. It certainly wasn't something that everyone has access to. So then the main shift in my thesis started to think about how can architecture enable and enhance access to these learning experiences. And so it's kind of this dual thread. So I look at both resource scarce and resource abundant innovation environments and start to peel out what devices within those environments kind of enhance that creativity and start to think about how these environments can talk to one another, how we need to start thinking about learning through difference rather than surrounding ourselves with the same types of groups, peoples, and spaces. So my hypothesis. Architecture can cultivate community, shared discourse, and individual learning by reconstituting learning spaces as public commons. This infrastructure first marks an urban public space and then allows for community interaction with and authorship of space and program. So the goal of the thesis would be to reconstitute learning as this public commons, just as you have access to public resources such as water, and energy, electricity. Learning opportunities would also be one of those infrastructures. Spatial agency is another kind of theme and driver of this thesis, and I want to highlight a few kind of actors and projects that inspired me. Urban Think Tank's project in Venezuela, the Vertical Gym, is a gym within an informal settlement. Basically that center and hub that accommodates the needs of many people. Down to the moment scale of Scarpa, thinking about how in all of his designs there's these playful, really well thought out moments that are the human scale too. And then in Bogota, BiblioRed is a project where there's different scales of libraries, both large central access and then what you might call ATMs for learning, more disparate, decentralized places. Main theories, Colin McFarland's Urban Learning Forum. Urban learning forums entail the possibility of different actors and knowledges within the city coming together to participate in the context of unequal power relations in collective learning. If managed carefully to facilitate sustained intensity, openness, and quality, these learning forums take urban planning in uncertain directions and increase the possibility of more socially just urbanism. The process of my design really post-research, the design research part became apparent when I started collaging, and the process of collaging is very similar to the process of how I arrived at these designs. With the collage, I first started by selecting images that I thought would be conducive to environments that would spur creativity. So it's first that selection. Then it's cutting the images, taking parts away that seemed relevant to me, then grouping those associations, grouping particular images that relate to one another, overlapping them, and then finding new alignments between those parts. So I did a series of studies looking at, the previous one was kind of a linear path. What if there were moments of these learning experiences or opportunities along a path versus what happens when I kind of agglomerate all of these experiences in one place and it starts to become more of an event space versus just changing out one element. What does that do to the composition? So these are some takeaways from the collages. Strategic juxtaposition of services. This is one of the biggest parts of this design is in each context, this is what's really local about the design, is what services need to be positioned near one another in order to create the most access or attract different types of people to those spaces. And then how does that juxtaposition reveal overlapping values or this kind of, this new way of looking at a learning opportunity? So when it comes down to it, my design is about the human-centered design experience. So everything relates to how someone might interact with it or feel within that space. As I decided where to kind of explore this context, I ended up traveling to Mumbai, and I chose Mumbai because, well, there in the city I did research and field work, ethnographic interviews with numerous people in the community that I've designed in. And their stories are the drivers for my project. I went to Mumbai thinking that, oh, this would be a great place because I can see there's a lot of energy, it's thriving, there's a lot of stimulus. And that's what you would need in a creative environment. I went there, and after interviewing numerous people, my position shifted, and I realized infrastructure, general resources is what will bring and attract a lot of different groups to a place. And learning can be one of those resources, but it doesn't need to be the main driver. It can kind of sit in the background. So through my research, I did a lot of documenting of activity space and what type of, what times of day, what type of people were gathering in certain places. And ended up with the scope that I wanted to design a central urban learning commons bridging resource-scarce and resource-abundant environments. I suggest an urban network of nodes or possible decentralized areas, but I don't delve into that deeply. I really focus more on the center. And then, again, I chose Mumbai. It's there's 19 million people that currently live in Mumbai, 62% of which live in informal settlements. So that's over 9 million people, which is larger than the city of New York. So I began to be very interested about, okay, what are those edge conditions then, or could I find edge conditions where this informal logic and the formal logic meet, and might that be an opportunity for a public space? So Mumbai had historically a central business district. It still is, although it's currently shifting, in the lower southern portion, which is now very congested. It's now shifted to my site, which is on an edge with Vanderkurla Complex, the new central business district, where basically Mumbai being the center of finance and industry in India, everything is shifting to this site. This is part of the bigger ground for the site. I am specifically focusing on this hinge point between Vanderkurla Complex, the corporate complex, and Bharatnagar, which is an informal settlement, and looking at that edge condition. Close proximity is a pretty nice suburban suburb, pretty upscale, as well as the University of Mumbai. So on my travels, I began to kind of document and think about which spaces might be relevant or which would be the most effective as far as an intervention, and decided that this really would be the most effective and would have the most foot traffic by the site. And then ultimately on the site, the first thing that I look at is really this edge condition and kind of working with the current logic of the site. There's, I've shifted for your orientation, this is actually north, and I've shifted the site plan. But there's this logic following the river that I continue with the north-south. And the river is really this wayfinding element within the community. So I wanted to base the design off of that. And first introduce an infrastructure trunk line to this community that currently doesn't have enough electricity or electrical distribution And then I also introduce potable water and fiber optic cables. The next move, as you can see in the diagram, is reinforcing the edges, kind of claiming part of this main pedestrian promenade, and then claiming an edge here as well, framing a central open space in the middle. Some of the precedents I looked at have to do with a lot of variable changing environments that have many different services associated with them. And then as far as a functional programmatic precedent, I looked at the Guggenheim Labs, which, for example, had 165 different programs within 29 days, all free. So this type of changing environment, just framing space. So this was functionally and programmatically definitely something I wanted to emulate. So the mission statement of the organization that will manage this site is called the Urban Learning Forum. Mission statement is, Urban Learning Forum is a public-private partnership that creates common ground through space and programming to bring creatives together in an effort to enable communities to adapt, transform, and thrive in changing urban conditions. Urban Learning Forum promotes resilience and provides space for creativity to thrive with three main components. So there's the ULF Play Study, which is recreation and classes, ULF Startup, which has supportive creative entrepreneurs with space, network programs, and mentorship, so people can come there for advice. And then ULF DesignNet, urban community initiatives and programming, local and global network, design and creativity processes. So all that can be found within this site. So I'm going to transfer over to the boards now. And the way I want to share a little bit more about the design is through the narrative of a few people that I interviewed and met there. The first being exchange. So the exchange edge is this edge here, and it's mainly based on this collection chute for inorganic waste. And there's this plug-in, the chutes are here, and there's a waste transfer barge. This is important specifically because of a person I met named Abdullah. And Abdullah is a waste picker. So currently, along this edge is where all the waste from Ratnagar is deposited. So Abdullah makes a living by picking waste and then reselling that waste to Dharavi, which runs a waste reclamation initiative. And so he sells what other people throw away. So Abdullah, he's actually here, through this design, will have the ability to come to the sorting and materials exchange, a series of CMU block-built 4-foot containers, and these are the same size that fit the standard cart. That is it's like a bullock cart, but it's very prevalent for both food storage, selling, and transfer of goods. So I took the same spec material and designed an insert for the cart so that Abdullah can now stack these fabric inserts and collect waste in a disparate network, and then come back to the sorting field, sort different plastics in, and then be able to deposit this and weigh in at the chutes. So this enables him to have a place to conduct his business and have a livelihood. The exchange edge really, in each of these designs you'll notice the spectrum of very fixed, durable, meaningfully durable interventions versus incredibly variable interventions. So I would say the durable nature is that the waste edge is able to withstand flooding from the monsoons, but then also there's this kind of decentralized aspect where he's able to go anywhere and collect waste anywhere. Next would be another kind of disparate part, and this network-based part of the initiative would be this sponsored paving. In the site plan, the sponsored paving shows up as this path kind of leading to the central hub. And the path mimics the curves and nooks of an informal settlement, that kind of surprise that you find when you turn corners and you're not going in a straight direction. These paving patterns can be sponsored by different small businesses or entrepreneurs or businesses from BKC or anywhere else who wants to rent out and sponsor these spaces. Just shown here. The lighting poles are, I have kind of a mock-up here. This is half of one at half scale, and it's cut, so this would really be 4 feet. Just carry this with me. So the poles are meant to be removable. So has anyone been to Rome? Okay, so in Rome there are these pavers, and they're shaped like this. They're very deep into the ground, and people are constantly pulling them up and replacing them. And so this carries that same idea that there would be certain patches where there would be pavers, and those pavers could be pulled up, and lighting, the receiver would be placed in there for potential future lighting. It's a way to mark the space, but then also create new spaces. So the light part could also be removed and aggregated in other ways, and then the part that it's fastened to could be used to hang tents and other types of temporary infrastructure. The next idea is based off of a story from Preeti. Preeti is a mother of 5, and she currently cooks a great deal of meals for people in offices in the Central Business District. And now that the Central Business District has moved, she has the opportunity to expand her business, but one thing she noted is that during the monsoon season, she runs out of storage, so she needs more shelter and a way to store food and create more food during the wet season. So the idea is that she could be part of this community where she can participate in cooking in the demo kitchen and cafe, but then also have a plot in the community garden, roof garden, that is maintained by the Urban Learning Forum, and participate in it. She can also have a space within these 8-foot cellular covered market stalls that could be transformed and used really for anything, but for her purposes, it's a great way to have a year-round space to sell her goods. And then lastly, above this the program really becomes lifted at this height to allow for trucks to come through to drop off raw materials, but it also is lifted because of the flood for the monsoon season, so it allows for programming to continue and for the learning labs to continue all year round. And then lastly, the water tower. There is a current water tower actually located just down this road, but it only accommodates 8,000 people, and there's 30,000 in the community. So the water tower, a couple main design choices. I wanted to fit at least within the footprint of current existing water towers in India, to show that you can work within that existing footprint for any infrastructures. So this is what a lot of the water towers look like, and there's this empty space within it. So I'm seeking to use that instead of having a massive tank at the top. I have smaller spec tanks that can be, if there's less demand, can be removed and the space can be used for something else. Okay, so for this narrative, Chetan is a community leader, and so right now he has a lot of trouble. He has a good group that he communicates with, but he has a lot of trouble reaching people on the periphery. So the water tower is a space for people to gather and kind of for him to advertise initiatives that are going on in the community and then meet with people in the Urban Learning Forum, which has an office above. And then this infrastructure also is adaptable. It allows for people to get water from each faucet, but then during the hot and dry season, it can also be a rinse-off station for people to cool. And then the faucet can be folded up for that to be just a general meeting space. So I'd love to hear any comments, suggestions, if you want to hear anything else about the design. There's a lot of other narratives up here.
How does the water get in the water?
Just before we answer that, I failed to recognize Luis, who's joining us from Costa Rica and was a part of this committee from the beginning. But you are the one that did not get introduced, so apologize.
No problem.
Valerie, how does the water get in the water tower? Is there a pipe system?
Yep. So the pipe system is along the northern side, so it's pumped up on the same side where it's where gravity then allows it to access the faucets. What I noticed about the existing water tower is it's only 75 feet tall, and the water towers are meant to be at least 80, so I'm trying to increase the gravity for it to have more pressure coming down. But yeah, it's pumped up through a chase.
Could you also just,
Located here, it's easily seen on the plan actually.
sorry, could you say a few words about your verbs and the studies you did, the dialectic studies you did, spatializing the verbs and spatializing, coming to these forms ultimately?
Sure. So I'd love for you to pass these along. So this is one example of what I call a spatial prototyping element. So part of this thesis was, yes, looking at this site scale in the specific context, but then also I surveyed people and asked them about what types of verbs, thinking of space as a verb, what types of verbs would you imagine being associated with different creative environments? And then I took those and set them against their opposite and tried to spatialize both of those verbs. And so in this particular one that I'm holding, I took so I took the verb and then I actually paired it with something I felt was more spatial. And so this verb is called embed. And so, yeah, embed was meant to provide a safe space, a dedicated space within a fabric. So I did a couple different iterations for selected verbs.
Show us where embed makes it into the design.
Sure. So embed makes it into the design in actually the cultivate part. So in the Food and Learning Hub, you can see it best in the roof plan. There's this one dedicated section that can be closed off. Actually, I forgot to mention that this right-hand side of the building remains always open, including the stairs. And this left-hand side of the building can be sealed and closed. Within that embed is this portion here that is a safe space, especially I was thinking of interviews I had with women who didn't feel comfortable participating in some of the activities I was suggesting because they felt they needed a safer space to be creative. This is just based off of 2 interviews.
So these universal prototypes as opposed to Indian-specific prototypes?
These are universal prototypes.
What are some of the other verbs?
This verb is plug-in. So plug-in, I said, you can think of it a couple ways. A whole and part. You can think of it as like a mouth and a block. So I took plug-in and really started to think about, okay, this goes hand in hand with the infrastructure side of the project, and plug-in appears especially at the waste barge, where you have these chutes that are sealed and can contain waste, and when on command, on demand, can release that waste into the barge and plug into that general network of waste infrastructure in Mumbai.
Well, I just want to start off saying that I really feel like you've made a real thesis. I really appreciate the layers of investigation and the media with which you investigated those different layers. I think you've been incredibly even at considering all of the different criteria that might move in to consider to produce a project, and you haven't fallen into over either a simplification or necessity to actually solve the problem, but you're essentially trying to find a way to create some form of infrastructure that is truly informal or that can be appropriated by a whole series of different programs and contexts and activities. And I want to sort of link your early studies with collage or perhaps more montage, but in each of those, what is really, really crucial are several things, but for anything to be able to sit next to it, fundamental collage, you take a piece of paper and you put another piece of paper next to it, and for them to begin to have a dialogue, each one has to have the ability to do two things. They have to have an identity on their own, but they also have to have the capacity to be changed or transformed or appropriated by the other piece of paper. So that dialogue is really crucial to the success of a third meaning that emerges as a function that's greater than just 1 + 1. 1 + 1 = 3 essentially instead of 2. And I think, so I really appreciate those early studies, because I think you are trying to create a kind of a montage, a kind of collection of moments that transcend the individual elements that went into it. And I think when you're talking about formal and informal, I think in the end that is really crucial, this notion of appropriation, that once you fix something and it loses its ability to become many things for many interests, and yet it has to have enough identity so that it doesn't lose itself entirely. So in the end, I think with your project for a whole series of different scales, fundamental is this, on one level, the notion of inserting some form of grid at different scales, whether it's a paving grid or a structural grid or a lighting grid, and at the scale of the body, the scale of the building, at the scale of the landscape. You really introduce a kind of a very simple device that can then be appropriated for different things, whether it's lighting, whether it's marking advertisement, whether it's literally dealing with gravity. And I think you've done that really, really beautifully. So, but it's no longer a generic, because it takes on certain roles and performs certain kind of cultural and behavioral conditions. I really appreciate the model that's passing around, which clearly where the white, is it around somewhere, where the white is essentially the ground, the more generic, I would argue, the frame of the base condition that you as an architect are bringing to the context, and then the inserts, the inlays, the shears, the plugins, let's say all the terms, the branches, the carve, the procedures that you use become the devices with which the community or the individual or the collective kind of introduce into that framework to create specificity. So again, I think you've done a really beautiful job with that. Perhaps I understand you focused on a specific site, but even though I see embedded in the way you address this site the ability for it actually to have no boundaries, that in fact the grid could, one could overlay a grid on the entire informal city and begin to kind of, like a surgeon, move in and kind of colonize certain moments that would create an opportunity for shade or an opportunity for shelter or an opportunity for water. And so I think ultimately that's the strength of the project, that it is site-specific on one hand, but actually can move out into much greater context. I really appreciate the kind of blurring of boundaries of things that begin to, even though you didn't really talk about in those terms, but that define a kind of public space along the edge of the water, but are simultaneously very pragmatic infrastructural elements that really serve a really crucial need in the community, of whether it's Ethernet, or whether it's waste or water and so on. And I think maybe those sorting bins are also benches, or also places where you can plug your iPhone in, or in other words, there's a really much that they become kind of, because that's where people are going to be congregating and collecting, where you can wash, there are fountains. So again, the idea that nothing is ever, it's specific enough to create identity or create that they are there, but also open-ended enough to be able to be appropriated, I think is really fantastic. I also think the narrative that you brought to it and the way you represented it, is a kind of really interesting notion of trying to not design for everyone, but to kind of create examples of how one individual might in fact appropriate these elements that you put there, which I think, so in other words, they motivate a particular moment in this transformation of this kind of prototype that you put forth, but also one can imagine multiple programs being given to it. The one thing that I might have encouraged you to do a bit more specifically would be to really design, not necessarily IKEA style, but if we come in with this concrete and we make these kind of primary infrastructures, what are the plugins? Are they constructed out of a locally available material, or what is the intelligence that they bring? Is it the individual who knows how to build these plugins, or is it the architect who determines it? But I think not. I think it really is an individual, but it's a kind of kit of parts that can, again, be misappropriated. And maybe it's recycled elements from the garbage. There might be some other way in which one uses the kind of the detritus of one to produce the kind of opportunity of the other. And so there needs to be somebody in there, I think, to curate what those kind of nested elements are, or those kind of inserts are within that system, if they are truly to be informal and kind of motivated by the individual. But yeah, I think I really appreciate your project. I think it's fantastic.
Well, Valerie, I think you gained a sensitivity to an appropriate response, I think in large part by the experiences that you put yourself into in Mumbai and the individuals that you interacted with. Because I think they helped you bring a sensibility to this that's perhaps different from what we as Western architects will typically seek to impose on a community like this. We'll often develop highly institutionalized, formal, almost precious kinds of solutions, set pieces that where we have defined, where we think we've carefully defined all the needs, we've carefully defined and anticipated all the ways in which people will use the facility we design. Well, that just doesn't happen in environments like this. You talked about innovation happening in a resource-scarce environment, and that's what you appreciate if you go to places like Mumbai or Mexico City or Rio. You see bright, intelligent people making the most of scarce resources, and they innovate in remarkable ways. You use the word appropriate any number of times in describing this building, and I would have every confidence that if this were constructed, the community would over time appropriate it in ways that you hadn't anticipated, but which your design will facilitate. Because it's open-ended. It isn't closed, it isn't finished, it isn't so highly defined that that it'd be abandoned because it wasn't versatile enough to respond. Again, the specific interaction and response to human beings is something that will serve you well in practice too. Because when we talk about projects, when we market work to clients, making the connection to who they are and what their needs are and who they're serving is really key to conveying and bringing value with design in serving our clients. So I commend you. I love the collage work as well. I think there's a dynamism and a flexibility and a creativity to the exploration that you made there that has helped follow through in the design decisions you made about the building.
Yeah, I agree. I think the way you've gone about approaching this and the restraint you showed to allow this to really rest on the kind of system development of the different kinds of expansion or contraction that you could imagine the users developing on site. I think, again, the collage work, I think the spatial formal studies, and just the way in which you built this narrative out of these very personal situations, and then applied them in a very kind of general way that we can imagine a whole host of new people and new stories starting to develop here. I really think that the formal language of this could be appropriate. I could imagine that this would start to populate pockets in the neighborhood and across the city as the people and the ideas that would be generated here. And that's really where your motivation started. Where how do we bring people together to allow the creativity that exists in this community and in this population to find this space? And I guess that's the part of the restraint that I see here so nicely done. That you've just created, you've emancipated a little, void in the city, and then placed in enough of an armature that I can imagine, this building growing to a third or fourth level as more space is required. It's going to go up and down the street. It's going to start to appropriate out here onto the waterfront. Just all the different things you talked about in your narrative, you start to see the seed ready to germinate that's existed in the architecture. It's because the architecture is it's really just a scaffold at the moment, right? I think there's a part of me that feels that is remarkably underdeveloped, and then that part of me that's like, well, I'm glad it's underdeveloped, because if it was any more specific, and I think, again, given your very specific formal spatial developments of these different verb actions, that you did that, but then didn't just directly apply that plug-in didn't become the second floor, and this other piece didn't become the kind of formal proposition. And I think that shows the kind of perseverance of your kind of research logic here, that it wasn't, those were one way to test an idea, but those forms didn't necessarily translate one-to-one to solve a problem. I think that goes back to your
so integral, you forgot to tell us about it. This idea of applying these to this was so integral to your solutions, you didn't feel, it didn't strike you to bring it out to us.
Absolutely. So I think, especially for many of the other students out here watching this today, I think this shows a really mature way about developing a thesis project to say, here are the boundaries I'm setting up for myself, but I have to continually check myself against those to say, is it really serving my ultimate goal? And there may be explorations. I could talk about some of these collages for another hour, but they were motivations that led you someplace else. It doesn't necessarily mean that each piece becomes the next piece. And I think that's something hopefully the students in the back of the room start to appreciate.
Actually, just one more comment, mostly for those of you who are following, is looking at Valerie's boards. One of the things that I really appreciate actually is your last three boards, in that the bottom area literally leaves a lot of space, is white. The architecture is simply black and white. It's an infrastructure, it's a scaffolding. And then it's the top of the board where you're showing it inhabited. And that's what has the color. And even though the people are still there's a ghosting of it, there's a sense of possibility and change. And so the mixing of those two representations, the base and then the inhabitation, reinforces the ideas that you're sharing with us. And I wanted to just comment on that, because the representation is key in getting the conversation going.
Yeah, it's a beautiful composition.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Very nice project. Congratulations. And I think it's nice to see somebody go totally to another culture and really try and think carefully and synthesize what they can out of that. Because in the end, that helps us understand our own culture, and I think that's a very valuable experience. Did you spend a lot of time in India doing this, or?
I wish I spent more time, and I was only traveling a month, so it's not enough time to really understand fully, but I wanted to test what we can do as designers and how do you start the conversation.
So I have just a couple of comments. The way the building is conceived and the idea is very thoughtfully laid out. What's a little bit unclear to me is the pathways and the leading through it, and whether or not, it seems like you're trying to facilitate the building, enhancing the sense of people moving towards the waterfront there, and maybe it's the sort of thing that people move through in kind of a non-hierarchical way through this neighborhood. There's not any one way through it, but they're sort of moving through this almost like a sieve there to the water, and maybe it just seems like this almost like a hierarchical place picked, and maybe that wouldn't be the way people, those things, those little pop-up things might be things you might find throughout. But the other comment I want to make is something that was alluded to earlier about the things you put in the structure that come afterwards, after you leave, and things are going to happen. It reminds me of when Corbu did that housing estate in France, and he came back a couple years later, they had put flower boxes and shutters and things on it, and he had a very interesting reaction. Everybody thought the great architect was going to be upset, and he said, well, he said, life is always right, we architects must learn from that. It was a very interesting reaction, and I think one of the things you'd have to figure out is the extent to which, after you make this initial design move, the things that come after, do you control that or not? Do you simply allow for the color to inhabit it, the way the culture is expressed, because it's a culture, I think, that is very, very much about color, and about texture, and about senses, all the different senses engaging your urban experience. And it'd be interesting to imagine rendering this building 5 or 10 years down the road. What might be the kind of things that one might see happen to it over time?
Just a minute. I'm going to ask Luis, because he doesn't get a chance to grab the mic, if he has any thoughts or reactions to contribute.
Well, I do have a comment since I've been part of Valerie's process since the beginning. Val, I also want to congratulate you. I think the process is clear. And one of the things that I think you have demonstrated throughout this past year is your ability as a designer to get rid of preconceptions. And one of the things that you mentioned was that at the beginning you were looking at academic structures, but then at some point, and I think the way you said it was they became secondary. And I think actually by exposing these sort of creative solutions to actual problems, and by exposing creativity to the community, you're suggesting a sort of creative citizenship that then becomes valuable, a new value for that community. And so I think these small sort of acupunctural interventions are incentivizing a new kind of citizenship. And I think that's very powerful, and my feeling is it's going to have a lot of impact. So on that side, congratulations. I won't comment on the drawings because I can see them really, really well, but I really appreciated your presentations, and I'm sure your drawings are great, even though I can see them in detail. But great work, and thanks for having me today.
Thanks for joining us, Luis. All the way from Costa Rica.
I just wanted to pick up on Luis's comment. I love that term, creative citizenship. And what I wanted to talk about was how important I think your thesis is, not just for the school, but also for the university. I know that you've been working with the Academy for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and a goal of that academy is probably to create creative citizens all around campus. I think you and others have been teaching design thinking, and one of the tenets of design thinking is that design begins with empathy. And in the design thinking course I teach to undergraduates, the hardest thing for them is to go out and do these empathy interviews and reach the insights about what could be game-changing for those individuals. And I think that you've shown a remarkable ability to understand just what it is that, in these human needs that could be game-changing. And I think that you've seen the game not as a kind of instant, I can fix it, but that, this wonderful ability to just set the intervention in motion. And looking around the room, I wish it was packed with people from the academy, because I think that this thesis is a really high development of what comes when you deploy design thinking out in the world. And I hope that you're going to bring this back to the academy.
Yeah, sure.
Because I think it's very important as an exemplar of just what it is that, the campus as a whole is excuse me, striving to develop in the future citizens that we're turning out.
What I think is really interesting is you're doing kind of tactical moves to create a strategic result, which is kind of backwards in a way, but it's I think what you need to do in this kind of environment.
It's kind of hard to follow all these comments. But one thing I have to say, I'm very impressed at the way that you were able to synthesize what you saw and you experienced, and were able to adapt and transform what you first set out to do to what you ended up doing. Your creative path and the way you are introducing that to this community as a way of solving problems and help the community is fantastic. One thing I was wondering, you created a space that is flexible, and flexibility, more and more is key in everything we're doing. But one thing I was wondering is, are you producing spaces that could be adapted to residential uses or to other uses that are not even currently in your plan? And if you're doing so, then maybe the secret is in the details, and now you actually provide this infrastructure that you are providing at the river's edge, such as waste and water and electricity and all that, which is something we do at the micro scale when we're designing a building such as a library, for example, where we're designing and we're trying to foresee the future uses of that space and try to afford maximum flexibility by bringing in power grids and bringing all these things, and let creativity happen as it may. And so when I'm looking at that, I find that wonderful, but I'm wondering if it's still maybe a little rigid in that sense, if it could be even more flexible by having that second layer of infrastructure throughout the space. But I commend you a fantastic thesis. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I had a wonderful semester working with you, and I know there was a transition between the spring and the fall, and I'm really honored to have a chance to have chaired you, at least for a semester. I think one of the things you brought to this project as a Path B student was an incredible verbal ability, and you as a student have been, like Madeline suggested, very involved as also a leader. And I think you were able to translate this verbal ability and this kind of natural leadership into something spatial. And the lesson that you learned, I think, was your thesis project, that learning is it's embodied, right? It's about observation and action in an environment. And that's very, very clear in your thesis, all the way from these very verbal to spatial diagrams, and then in the kind of rich moments that are connected to personal narratives. So I think that's a really beautiful part of the thesis project. The other thing that I just wanted to also echo, Valerie's been involved in the Academy for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. She's led workshops, but she also was awarded the Schwartz Traveling Scholarship. And that was really an investment that the faculty made, a year ago in Valerie, saying, this student we think has a lot of potential and deserves this scholarship. And I heard the word follow through, and I think what I see today is an incredible follow through and sort of giving back in a situation where you received this prize, and you were very, very deserving of that, and I'm so glad that you had a chance to go to India to kind of kickstart this project. I think that's it. Thanks, Valerie.